You're not my father anymore. Don't call me or text me. As far as I'm concerned, you're gone. Those were the last words my son said to me before we lived in silence for 5 years. It all started 3 days before Thanksgiving when he told me not to come home. His wife didn't want me there. I sat alone in a restaurant eating a meal I couldn't taste. That's when a woman walked over and asked if I wanted to have dinner with her family. I thought it was pity. I thought it was temporary. I had no idea that one single yes could change my life forever. Hello, and thank you for being here with me. Before we continue, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your presence matters more than you know. Just a quick note, this story includes some fictional elements added for storytelling and reflection. Any similarities are coincidental, but the perspective may resonate. My name is Preston Dalton. I had just turned 56 that autumn. I'm 61 now, looking back with a clarity I didn't have than 5 years of distance reflection and hard-earned understanding. Most of my life, I've been good at disappointing people. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, through pauses that linger too long, through answers that land wrong, through the slow realization on someone's face that I won't be what they hoped I'd be. That Thanksgiving, sitting alone in a restaurant in Austin, Texas, a city I'd moved to only a year earlier, hoping for a reset. I learned something I hadn't expected: how it feels to let yourself down. The air smelled like roasted turkey and baked apples. The room was full of families, real ones. A grandfather carved a turkey while his grandchildren leaned forward, watching like it was a sacred ritual. Nearby, an older couple shared a plate, their hands resting together, as if they'd done it 1,000 times before. A woman laughed at something her daughter said, an easy, unguarded sound that warmed the space around them. And there I was, alone. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my son Gerald had called. His voice didn't sound like my son's. It was clipped, distant, like someone calling about a bill. "Gerald, hey," I said carefully. "How are you?" "I don't have much time," he replied. "I'm calling because I need something. Something important." My stomach tightened. I recognized that tone. It was the same one he'd used whenever he was about to ask for more than I could give. "All right," I said. "What do you need?" "Rebecca and I are involved in a business venture," he explained. "A tech startup. It has potential, but we need additional funding to keep it alive. If we don't act soon, everything falls apart." I listened. "I need $50,000, he said. "By the end of June, you just sold the house in Connecticut. You have the money." There was no hesitation in his voice, no request, just assumption, as if the decision had already been made for me. Gerald the first began. "Before you say no," he cut in. "If this fails, Rebecca and I lose everything, our savings, our future. You're in a position to help." I could hear Rebecca in the background, her voice low but insistent, guiding him. "I don't think giving you $50,000 is the right move," I said evenly. "I don't know enough about this investment. Have you spoken to a financial advisor?" His tone sharpened. "This isn't about risk. It's about whether you actually care, or whether all that talk about wanting a relationship is just noise." I closed my eyes. I was standing in the bookstore, surrounded by shelves of quiet wisdom, while my son used guilt like leverage. "I do care," I said, "but handing over that kind of money doesn't feel responsible. I think you should talk to a professional." "I think—" "You think?" he snapped. "After you left our family? After you moved across the country and walked away from Mom?" "I didn't walk away from you," I replied, steady. "I left a marriage that wasn't working. I stayed in touch with Rachel. I've tried to stay connected with you, even when you push me away." "That's because you owe us," he said flatly. "You owe Mom. You owe me. You don't get to start over like none of it mattered." I thought of Isabella, of William, of Rachel, who loved me without keeping a tally. I thought of shared meals of people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they felt entitled. "That's not how family works," I said quietly. "Family isn't about debt. It's about presence. And right now, you're not showing up for me. You're demanding money, and when I ask questions, you turn my past into a weapon." There was a pause. "So that's a no," he said, his voice calm but edged with something cruel. "Yes," I said, "it's a no." I heard Rebecca again, angry this time. Then Gerald spoke slowly, clearly. "Then you're dead to me. You're not my father anymore. Don't call, don't text, don't try to reach out. You don't exist in my life. Gerald." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, surrounded by books and silence. I didn't feel rage, I felt relief. I realized I didn't know how to be the father he wanted, but I no longer believed I had to be. I had Sunday dinners with Isabella and William. I had Rachel, who loved me without conditions. I had a life in Austin that was quiet, imperfect, and real. Gerald could erase me from his world, but for the first time in years, I felt present in my own. That night, I called Rachel and told her everything. She listened, then said softly, "Dad, I'm proud of you. You protected yourself. That's not selfish. That's healthy." After we hung up, I sat in the dark and cried, not from loss, but from the strange, unexpected relief of finally letting go. Before Thanksgiving, I'd tried to build a bridge. Not to Gerald exactly, but to the idea of Gerald. To the son I'd once known before distance and resentment had turned him into a stranger. It started with a phone call to Rachel 3 weeks earlier. "I'm thinking about visiting Gerald," I'd said, testing the words. "Maybe fly back to Connecticut for a long weekend. See if things have settled down between us." There was a pause. Rachel was good at pauses. They meant she was choosing her words carefully. "Dad, I don't know if that's a good idea right now," she'd finally said. "Gerald's been difficult. Rebecca's been in his ear." But I was 55 then, still believing that proximity could fix things. That if I just showed up in person, looked Gerald in the eye, I could explain myself. So I'd booked a flight for early December, Austin to Hartford, 4 hours there a weekend with Gerald back by Sunday night. I'd also done something else, sold the house in Connecticut. It had taken 3 months of realtor open houses negotiations, but I'd finally let go of that place, the house where Gerald and Rachel had grown up, where I'd thought I was building something permanent, where everything had eventually collapsed. The sale closed in October. After paying off the mortgage and commission, I walked away with $273,000. It was a strange amount of money to have suddenly. Not wealth, but security. I'd moved most of it into a savings account I barely touched, living off what little I'd saved from my old job. But knowing I had that money changed something. It meant I didn't have to stay small anymore. I could afford to take risks. I could afford to fly across the country. I could afford to try repairing what I'd broken. So, I'd booked the flight, December 14th through 17th. I'd taken time off work. I'd even bought Gerald a gift, a watch, something I thought might appeal to him, something that said I'd been thinking about what he might want. I was 55 then, 56 by the time everything changed. Then came Thanksgiving and Isabella Ellington's unexpected kindness. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe there was something here in Austin worth staying for, that maybe I didn't have to chase ghosts in Connecticut. But Gerald was still my son. The trip was still booked. So after Thanksgiving, I called Gerald. "Hey, I was wondering if we could talk about something," I said when he answered. "Sure, Dad. What's up?" "I booked a flight to Connecticut," I said. "Early December. I'd really like to see you. I know things have been strained, but you may stir an hour or so." "Oh, Dad." His voice carried that familiar quality, the one that suggested he was about to disappoint me. "Rebecca and I are going to be really busy that weekend. It's the holidays. We have parties, family stuff." "It's okay if Rebecca's busy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I came to see you. We could just grab dinner or—" "I don't think this is a good time," Gerald said, the door closing. Again. "That's Gerald." "I sold the house," I said. It came out too fast, like I was offering him something, when really I was just explaining the hole I was standing in. "I closed on it in October. I have the money now to help you if you need it." "I said it's not a good time," Gerald repeated, and now there was an edge to his voice. "Why do you keep pushing—" I hung up after that. I couldn't remember what else we'd said, just the click of the phone ending and the silence that followed. I went back to my apartment that night and sat on the couch in the darkness. I kept the flight booked for 3 more days before I finally called the airline and canceled it. I took the cancellation fee, $80, like a small punishment I deserved. But the gift was still in the box on my shelf. The watch, expensive, useless now. I thought about what it meant to have money and no one to spend it on. I thought about what it meant to have a son who didn't want to see me, no matter how far I was willing to travel. I thought about the house I'd sold, the furniture I'd left behind, the photographs and memories I'd tried to escape by moving to Austin. And I realized something. I was running from Connecticut, but I was also running towards something. I just didn't know what yet. That's when I remembered Isabella Ellington, the kindness in her eyes, the way she'd simply decided I mattered. The bookstore was quiet the next morning. I shelved books and helped customers find what they were looking for. And for the first time since I'd sold the house, since I'd booked and canceled that flight, since Gerald had rejected me for the 100th time, I thought maybe I'd been looking in the wrong direction all along. Maybe home wasn't Connecticut. Maybe home wasn't something you built with people who didn't want to build with you. Maybe home was something else entirely. Something you found in the kindness of strangers. Something you were offered when you least expected it. Sunday came, my usual day off, and I did something I hadn't done since arriving in Austin. Yes, I called Isabella Ellington. My 55th birthday had been a quiet affair. I was hoping he might want to fly down to Austin. We hadn't been close, but he was my son, and I still held on to the belief that if I tried hard enough, if I showed up consistently, maybe he'd show up too. "Dad," he'd said over the phone, and I could hear Rebecca in the background. "I'm sorry, but Rebecca's mother is having some health issues, and we promised to help her out that week. It's not a great time for me to travel." "Oh," I'd said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. "Of course. Family first. I understand." But even as I said it, I felt the lie settle into my chest. Gerald had never shown up for me on my birthday, not once. There had always been some excuse work, Rebecca money problems, timing. The excuses changed, but the result was always the same. I spent my birthdays alone. My 55th birthday was no different. I'd ordered Chinese takeout and sat in my apartment watching television. No cake, no celebration. Around 9 p.m., Gerald texted, "Happy birthday, Dad. Sorry I can't be there. Rain check." There would never be a rain check. We both knew that. But I responded anyway. "No problem. Thanks for the message. Love you." He never responded to that. That night I sat on my couch and thought about what 55 years of life had actually taught me. I'd spent more than half a decade on this earth, and what did I have to show for it? A son who didn't want to spend time with me, a daughter I barely knew, a career that had provided a paycheck but never fulfillment, an apartment that echoed with emptiness. I thought about all the birthdays before this one, the ones where I'd tried too hard, planned too much, hoped too desperately that this would be the year Gerald would actually care. The ones where I'd accepted the rejection with grace and moved on to the next disappointment. I thought about the pattern I'd let establish itself. I would reach out. Gerald would decline. I would accept it. And then I would do it all over again the next time. It was exhausting. It was heartbreaking. And I had no idea how to stop doing it. 3 months later, on Thanksgiving, Gerald called again. This time, the excuse was different, but the message was the same. "Dad, Rebecca doesn't think it's a good idea if you come over. She says it would be complicated." And that's when something shifted. Maybe it was because I'd just spent my birthday alone. Maybe it was because I'd hit 55 and realized I was running out of time to be someone other than the man who kept hoping for scraps of affection from people who weren't capable of giving it. Maybe it was just that I'd finally had enough. Whatever it was, I didn't argue. I didn't try to convince Gerald that I belonged in his house at his table in his life. I just accepted it. "Okay," I said, "I understand." And then I hung up and made a reservation at a restaurant because I'd decided something. If my family didn't want me, I would find other people who did. Later, sitting at the Ellingtons' table on that first Sunday dinner, Isabella asked me about my family. I found myself telling her about Gerald, about Rebecca, about the birthday I'd spent alone just 3 months earlier. "He called to apologize that day," I told her. "A text message at 9 p.m. But it wasn't really an apology, it was just a habit. Something he felt obligated to do." Isabella reached across the table and took my hand. "His loss, Preston," she said simply. "His loss." And I realized sitting there with this woman I just met that she was right. Gerald had chosen absence. He'd chosen to skip my birthday. He'd chosen to keep me at arm's length. He'd chosen money and comfort and a life where his father was an inconvenience. That was his choice, and I was finally at 55 years old, ready to stop paying the price for it. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I sat there for another minute or two, the apartment completely silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. The plane ticket was still in my hand. The wrapped gifts were still on my kitchen counter. The life I'd been planning was technically still available to me. All I had to do was get on that plane and show up. But I couldn't. Not after what Gerald had just said. Not after understanding what I'd been refusing to see for so long. I picked up my phone. Rachel answered on the second ring. She always did. My daughter had a way of making me feel like I mattered, like my call was the most important thing happening in her world at that moment. That "Are you okay?" Your voice sounds, "I'm fine," I said, but I wasn't. And somehow Rachel knew that already. What happened? So I told her about Gerald's call, about the 7 words, about the plane ticket that was now worthless, about the gifts I'd bought with such hope just hours ago. Rachel listened without interrupting. That was one of the things I loved about her. She actually listened. She didn't jump in with advice or try to fix things. She just let you say what you needed to say, and then she reacted honestly. When I finished, there was a pause. "Dad," she said carefully, "Gerald didn't make that decision. What do you mean? I mean, Rebecca made that decision. Gerald's just the messenger. You know how he is, he always does whatever she tells him to do. I thought about that. About all those conversations with Gerald where he'd started sentences with Rebecca thinks or Rebecca wants. About how he'd spent the last few years becoming less himself and more a proxy for his wife's opinions and preferences. I know, I said quietly. It's not fair. Rachel continued, her voice getting a little heated now. Gerald's a grown man. He should be able to make his own decisions about whether he wants his father at his Thanksgiving dinner. But he let her decide for him? He always lets her decide. I can't change that, I said. And I meant it. There was nothing I could do to make Gerald see what he was doing to himself. Nothing I could do to make him stand up to Rebecca. Nothing I could do to save him from his own choices. No, Rachel agreed. You can't. We sat with that truth for a moment. So what are you going to do? She asked. That was the question, wasn't it? I had a few options. I could sit at home and feel sorry for myself. I could spend the day alone in my apartment, staring at the worthless plane ticket and the unused gifts. I could call Gerald back and demand an explanation or beg him to reconsider, or let myself spiral into anger and resentment. Or I could do something different. I'm not going to let them ruin my day, I said. The words came out before I'd fully thought them through, but as soon as I said them, I knew they were true. What do you mean? Rachel asked. I mean, I'm going to Thanksgiving dinner, just not with them. Dad, I don't think... Not with family, just somewhere that's open, somewhere that serves a good meal and has other people around, somewhere that feels like something other than this apartment. I could almost hear Rachel nodding on the other end of the line. That's actually a great idea, she said. You shouldn't spend Thanksgiving alone just because Gerald and Rebecca are being assholes. I smiled despite myself. Rachel had never been one to mince words. Exactly, I said. There has to be restaurants open on Thanksgiving in Austin, she said, thinking out loud. Good ones. You could make a reservation, make a whole thing of it, treat yourself. Maybe, I said. Dad, seriously. You deserve to have a good day. You deserve to celebrate. Don't let them steal that from you. After we hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet of my apartment. I thought about Gerald. I thought about Rebecca. I thought about the years of small choices that had led to this moment, the moment where my son had decided his wife was more important than his father. It hurt. It definitely hurt. But Rachel was right. I didn't have to let that hurt define my day. I didn't have to sit at home and stew in it. I didn't have to let Gerald and Rebecca's decision become my tragedy. I stood up. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out a nice shirt, nothing fancy, but something that felt a little special. I changed out of the t-shirt and jeans I'd been wearing all day. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. When had I gotten so small? When had I started accepting less than I deserved? Then I walked to my closet and grabbed my jacket. The Austin evening was just starting to cool down as I opened the door to my apartment. The sun was hanging low in the sky, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. There were people out on the streets, families walking together, groups of friends heading out to dinner, kids running ahead of their parents. I looked at all those people living their lives, making their choices, and I made mine. I wasn't going to sit at home and wait for Gerald to call back and apologize. I wasn't going to spend Thanksgiving feeling sorry for myself. I wasn't going to let the rejection of my son and his wife define how I spent this day. I locked the door behind me and headed toward the street. Somewhere in Austin, there was a restaurant open on Thanksgiving. Somewhere there were people sharing a meal. Somewhere there was a chance for something unexpected to happen. And I was going to find it. After Thanksgiving dinner at the Ellington table, I didn't want to leave. This wasn't the polite reluctance of someone whose host was being generous. This was the desperate clinging of a man who just experienced something he didn't know existed. The warmth, the noise, the way people moved around each other with genuine affection, not obligation. When the meal finally wound down and dessert was being cleared, Isabella leaned over to me. "Preston?" she said, her voice soft but direct. "Do you have plans for next Sunday?" I almost laughed. Plans. My Sundays were empty. They were all empty. My weeks were empty. My life was empty. But I just shook my head. "No, ma'am, no plans." "Then come to our house," she said. It wasn't a question. We have dinner every Sunday, family tradition, nothing fancy, just a meal together. William always overestimates how much food to cook, so there's always too much. You should help us eat it. William, who'd been listening from across the table, smiled and nodded. "She's right. And the leftovers sit in the fridge getting wasted. You'd actually be doing us a favor." I didn't believe them. People don't invite strangers to their homes out of genuine need. But I also didn't argue, because the alternative was going back to my apartment, back to the silence and the empty walls and the weight of all my failures. "Okay," I said. "Thank you, I'd like that." 6 o'clock, Isabella said. "North Austin near Brushy Creek. I'll write down the address for you." Isabella pulled out a small pen and a receipt from her purse, the kind of thing a woman her age would carry. She wrote the address in careful handwriting and handed it to me. I looked at it, an address I didn't know, in a neighborhood I hadn't explored, in a city I was still learning to navigate. "I don't have your number," Isabella said, "but you don't need it. Just come. 6 o'clock this Sunday." I nodded, folding the address carefully and putting it in my wallet. The drive home that Thanksgiving night was different than I'd expected. Usually driving alone through Austin at night felt like drifting through a city that didn't know I existed. But tonight it felt like moving towards something, rather than away from it. I thought about Isabella's invitation. I thought about the way William had nodded in agreement, like they'd already discussed this, like they'd already decided I was worth inviting into their home. I thought about Rachel, my own daughter, who I'd carefully kept at arm's length to protect her from the burden of my neediness. And then I thought about this stranger who'd barely known my name an hour ago, and had decided that I should be part of her Sunday. The bookstore the next morning felt different. I shelved books and helped customers find what they were looking for, but my mind was elsewhere. I was counting down days until Sunday. I was wondering what to expect. I was, for the first time in months, looking forward to something. Saturday morning, I did something I hadn't done since moving to Austin. I went shopping. Not for groceries, I was careful with money, still adjusting to the strange reality of having savings. But I bought a bottle of wine from the store, where I'd started to recognize the owner's face. Something decent, not expensive, but thoughtful. I bought flowers from a grocery store stand. They felt too feminine somehow, too much, but I bought them anyway. And then I second-guessed myself, and almost returned them, but I kept them. Saturday night, I laid out my clothes for Sunday, the way I used to do when Gerald was small and we had somewhere important to go. I pressed a shirt. I polished my shoes. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. This mattered. I didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. Sunday morning came early. I had the address written down, but I still pulled it up on my phone's GPS to make sure I understood how to get there. North Austin. It was a drive I'd made vaguely before, but never with purpose. Never with a destination that mattered. I arrived at 5:47 p.m. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, holding the wine and flowers, trying to calm my breathing. This was ridiculous. I was a 56-year-old man about to have dinner with a family I'd met once. It was a kindness, nothing more. I shouldn't expect anything from it, but I did. I expected something. I expected maybe to feel less alone. I expected maybe to find some small corner of belonging, even if it was temporary. At 5:57, I got out of the car and walked to the front door. Isabella answered before I could knock, like she'd been expecting me. I would later learn she almost didn't stand up that night, almost didn't extend that invitation. She sat there for a full minute at the Thanksgiving table, hesitating. What if he said no? What if it was awkward? What if she was overstepping? But then William nudged her under the table, caught her eye, and nodded like he was saying, "Go. Trust your instinct." So she did. "Preston," she said, now smiling. "You came. Come in, come in." I handed her the wine, and Flowers, suddenly aware of how awkward I looked holding them. "These are beautiful," she said, and she meant it. I could tell by the way she held them, the way she looked at them. "William, look what Preston brought. And wine. Perfect. We're going to love having you here." William appeared from somewhere deeper in the house and shook my hand. His grip was warm, his eyes steady. He looked at me like he was taking my measure, deciding something about my character, and then he nodded, small and almost imperceptible, like he'd reached a positive conclusion. "Come on," he said. "The table's already set. We're just waiting on David and Karen. They're bringing the kids." As I stepped into the Ellington house, I realized something. There had been no exchange of phone numbers, no awkward moment where we'd figured out how I'd contact them or how they'd contact me. Isabella had simply invited me, given me an address, and expected me to show up. No safety net, no way to cancel easily. Just an invitation made in faith that I would come. It was the most trusting thing anyone had done for me in years. I thought I was handling it well. The mask was in place. I was smiling when I needed to smile, nodding at the right moments, playing the part of a man who had simply decided to treat himself to a nice Thanksgiving dinner alone. Nothing sad about it. Nothing broken. But then Isabella saw the tears. I didn't even realize they were there until I felt the first one slide down my cheek. I tried to catch it before anyone noticed, lifting my napkin, quickly turning my face toward the window, like I was just looking at the city lights. But Isabella had already seen. Of course she had. Women like Isabella, the kind who spent a lifetime noticing things about people they didn't miss moments like that. She said something to William. I caught the tail end of it. "Just a minute, dear." Then she stood up from her table and walked over to mine with the kind of casual grace that made it seem completely natural, like she wasn't about to walk into a stranger's private grief. "You all right?" she asked gently, pulling out the chair across from me without waiting for permission. I wiped my face quickly, forced a smile. The lie came automatic, practiced even. "Allergies," I said. "The restaurant has something in the air, I think." Isabella smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that believed me. "Preston," she said, and I was struck by how easily she used my name like we'd known each other for years instead of minutes. Allergies don't usually make people cry on Thanksgiving. There was no judgment in her voice, just a simple statement of fact. The kind of thing someone says when they've seen enough of the world to know the difference between a sneeze and heartbreak. I looked at her, really looked at her, and something in me just gave way. "My son," I started, and then I couldn't finish. The words got stuck somewhere between my brain and my mouth, caught in the tangle of everything I'd been trying not to feel. Isabella reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was soft, but her grip was firm, real. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said. "But I want you to know that you shouldn't be alone right now." I swallowed hard. "I don't really have a choice." "Everyone has a choice," Isabella said simply. "And I'm choosing to invite you to sit with us, with our family, if you want to." I almost said no. Some part of me wanted to protect myself, to keep the wound private the way you're supposed to when you're a man of a certain age. We don't cry in public. We don't accept kindness from strangers. We handle our problems alone. But sitting there looking at this woman who barely knew me, but somehow understood everything, I realized that pride was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. "Okay," I said quietly. "Yes, thank you." Isabella's smile widened. She stood up, extending her hand to help me up. I took it, grateful for the anchor, for the proof that I wasn't floating completely untethered. "Come on," she said. "I want you to meet everyone." The walk across the restaurant felt like it took hours, like I was crossing some kind of threshold into a different version of my life. All around me, families were eating their meals, caught up in their own conversations. None of them noticed one man following an older woman to a different table. None of them understood that something important was happening, but I did. The Ellington table was in the center of the restaurant, a position of prominence, I realized. A table where people wanted to be seen. William looked up as we approached his face, breaking into an immediate smile. Beside him sat a man who had to be David. He had William's eyes, that same quiet strength. David's wife Karen was holding a young grandchild, probably not more than 3 years old, who immediately reached toward Isabella with both arms. "Look who's joining us," Isabella announced, pulling out a chair that somehow appeared to be waiting for me. "Everyone, this is Preston Dalton. Preston, this is my family." William stood up and shook my hand again, but this time it felt different, deeper, like he was welcoming me into something. David extended his hand across the table with a warm greeting. Karen smiled, the kind of smile that only comes from genuine kindness. The baby, blonde-haired and gap-toothed, waved at me with a tiny hand, and I found myself waving back. "Preston, you sit right here," Isabella said, pointing to the chair she'd pulled out. "Between me and William, we're just about to cut into the turkey, and I have to tell you, it's one of the best I've had all year." I sat down, and something shifted inside my chest. It wasn't fixed. The pain was still there, still raw and real, but it was different now. Less like I was drowning, and more like someone had thrown me a rope. The hostess came by quickly with an extra plate glass and silverware, like she'd been expecting me all along, like somehow this had always been part of the plan. Isabella began serving me turkey, and Karen leaned over to ask if I preferred my dressing with or without pecans. "With," I said, surprised that I remembered. "Good man," David said, and there was something in his tone that made me realize he meant it, that this wasn't pity. This was something else, something genuine. The baby reached over and grabbed my hand, examining my wedding ring with the fierce concentration of someone who found all human artifacts fascinating. "He likes you," Isabella observed. "Our baby usually takes a while to warm up to people, but something tells me you're different." I looked at this woman, this stranger who had seen me broken in a restaurant, and decided to do something about it. At William, who was now loading my plate with second helpings of things I hadn't even asked for. At David and Karen, who would welcome me into their circle without hesitation. At the baby who was still holding my hand. I thought about Gerald's voice on the phone, about Rebecca's invisible presence between us, about all the ways I'd failed to be the father my son wanted. And then I looked at Isabella again, and she winked at me. Just a small gesture, a flash of connection. But it was enough to tell me something I'd almost forgotten. Family wasn't just what you were born into. Sometimes it was what you built. Sometimes it was what found you when you were sitting alone in a restaurant on Thanksgiving, broken and bleeding and absolutely convinced that nobody cared. Sometimes family was just people seeing you and deciding that you mattered. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, 6 months after Thanksgiving. I was shelving new arrivals in the philosophy section when my phone buzzed a number I recognized but hadn't heard from in months. Gerald. I almost didn't answer. For a moment I stood there between the Kierkegaard and the Sartre, my finger hovering over the screen. Around me, the bookstore hummed with its quiet afternoon rhythm, the soft turning of pages, the gentle tap of keyboards at the reading table, the occasional footfall on the worn wooden floor. This was my place now. Not just my workplace, but a place where I'd learned to exist without constantly defending my right to be here. I answered, "Dad." His voice carried something I couldn't quite name. Not warmth exactly, not coldness either. Something more fragile, more desperate. "How are you?" The politeness was strange. We exchanged brief pleasantries. How was Austin? How was the bookstore job? Fine, good, same. And I kept waiting for the real reason. Gerald didn't call just to ask how I was. He hadn't in years. "I was thinking," he said, "maybe you could visit. Rebecca's mentioned it would be nice if we all got together. The kids have grown so much," and I felt something in my chest shift. Not hope exactly. Caution. The bookstore suddenly felt very far away, even though I was still standing in it, my hand resting on a copy of Being and Nothingness. "That would be nice," I said carefully. There was a pause. I could hear him breathing, could sense him gathering something, courage perhaps, or the momentum for what he'd actually called to ask. "About that," he continued, "things have gotten a bit tight financially. Rebecca and I invested in something, a tech venture. We thought it would take off, but..." He trailed off and I recognized this hesitation. This was the preamble, the setup. "The thing is, we need some capital, just to keep it afloat through the summer. If we can get through the next quarter, I really think it's going to work." I said nothing. I was listening, but I was also listening to something else, to the part of me that had spent decades trying to solve Gerald's problems, trying to prove my love through money, through availability, through the desperate hope that if I just did enough, sacrificed enough, he would finally see me as worthy of being called son. Isabella had a way of looking at situations. She'd mentioned it during one of our Sunday dinners, the way William handled difficulty. He didn't rush to fix things. He stood still. He let people own their choices. How much, I asked. 50,000. The number hung there between us. I did the math quickly, the house sale, the retirement account, the modest safety net I'd built in these past 6 months. I had it. That was the terrible, beautiful part. I had it. "I can't do that," I said. "You don't understand." "I do understand," I interrupted, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "I understand that you're scared. I understand that Rebecca is pressuring you, and maybe her father is too. I understand that this feels like an emergency. But Gerald, I can't be the solution to this problem." He started to speak again, but I kept going. "I've spent a long time trying to be the kind of father who could fix things with money, who could prove love through availability and sacrifice. And all it did was teach you that I was someone to ask when you needed something, not someone you wanted to know." There was silence on the other end of the line, a real silence, not a pause. "That's not fair," he said finally. "You left us in Connecticut. I know what I did," I said, "and I own that. But I'm not going to keep paying the price for it by becoming the person who rescues you every time you make a choice you can't undo. That's not love, Gerald. That's just enabling. It's just me avoiding the harder work of actually being present as your father, not your financial emergency contact." I thought of Isabella's hesitation before she'd invited me to that first Sunday dinner, the way she'd stood at the threshold between charity and genuine connection. She'd chosen connection. She'd chosen to see me. "If you want to talk about what you're going through, I'm here for that," I said. "If you want advice about financial counselors or small business loans, I can help you find resources. But I'm not going to give you $50,000 and pretend that's the same as actually showing up for you. So that's it. You're done with me." The question cut through me as I suspect he knew it would. But something had changed. Isabella was part of my life now. William too. Rachel called me regularly. The bookstore had become a kind of sanctuary, not because it paid well, it didn't, but because the work itself was honest. I was learning to live in a different story about myself. "No," I said quietly, "but maybe we need to figure out a different kind of relationship. One where I'm not always trying to apologize for being your father, and you're not always trying to punish me for it." After we hung up, after he said nothing in response, just the soft click of disconnection, I stood in the philosophy section for a long time. A customer asked me where the poetry was, and I directed her automatically my mind elsewhere. I thought about the kind of man I'd become, about the difference between abandoning someone and setting a boundary, about how love sometimes looks like saying no. That evening I called Isabella to ask if I could bring wine to Sunday dinner. The parking lot was cool and quiet, the kind of November evening where the sky turns purple before it turns black. I sat in my car for a moment, before turning on the engine, replaying the night in my mind. The Ellington family. Isabella's hand on my arm. William's firm handshake. David's quiet strength. Karen's genuine warmth. The baby Marcus they had called him, sleeping peacefully against Isabella's shoulder. For the first time in 56 years, I'd felt like I belonged somewhere. Isabella had pressed something into my hand as we were leaving the restaurant. A business card, cream-colored simple. On the back in Isabella's careful handwriting, "We'd love to see you again, Preston. Sunday dinner at 7 p.m. You're always welcome. E." The address was printed on the front, North Austin, a neighborhood I'd driven through 100 times in my 1 year living here. Close, maybe 15 minutes from my apartment if traffic was light. I should have just driven there. I should have known Austin well enough after 1 year to navigate it without help. But my hands were shaking as I sat in the parking lot, and I realized I wasn't shaking from cold or fear. I was shaking because I was terrified I'd lose the address, that I'd drive the wrong direction and somehow miss the only real invitation I'd received in years. So I pulled out my phone and typed the address into Google Maps. Not because I didn't know where North Austin was, but because I needed the GPS to do more than navigate. I needed it to hold me steady. I needed a voice artificial calm, certain to tell me where to go. I needed the small blue dot on a map to prove that there was a destination waiting for me, that this wasn't a dream. The GPS calculated the route. 15 minutes, a left on Anderson Mill, a right on Brushy Creek, one more turn, and I'd be there. I sat in my car for another minute just breathing. Then I drove home to my empty apartment parked in a space that nobody was waiting in and went inside. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on my bed and stared at the business card, making sure the address didn't change. Making sure Isabella's handwriting was still there. Making sure it was real. The week crawled by. I worked my job, nothing glamorous, just enough to pay rent and sustain a life that didn't require much sustaining. I went to the grocery store. I came home. I sat with the business card on my nightstand and tried not to hope too hard that this wasn't some elaborate kindness that would disappear the moment I actually showed up at their door. Saturday night, I ironed a shirt. Sunday morning, I showered and shaved. I left my apartment at 6:30 p.m., driving slowly through Austin's Sunday evening traffic. The GPS guided me through familiar streets that suddenly felt new. I'd driven past these neighborhoods 1,000 times without ever really seeing them. Now, every corner seemed to matter. At 6:55, I pulled up to the address. The house was warm and inviting, a 2-story colonial with lights glowing in every window. I could see movement inside, a family getting ready for dinner. People I'd met once briefly and yet were expecting me, had wanted me, had offered me a place. I sat in my car for 5 minutes. Then I walked to the door, raised my hand to knock, and hesitated. This was the moment where I could still turn around. This was still the moment where I could tell myself it had been a kind gesture, but not meant to be followed through on. This was still the moment where I could protect myself by refusing to hope. But then the door opened. Isabella stood there in a warm sweater, her face lighting up the moment she saw me. "Preston, I was hoping you'd come. Come in, come in. William's in the living room. Everyone's so excited to see you again." I stepped across the threshold into warmth, into noise, into a house full of people who were somehow inexplicably glad I was there. As I followed Isabella toward the sound of voices and laughter and the smell of home-cooked food, I realized something. The GPS in my car wasn't just a navigation tool. It had been a lifeline. It had given me permission to believe I was going somewhere, that there was a destination that I mattered enough to arrive at. That evening I learned that sometimes getting lost is necessary. And sometimes the only way to find your way home is to let yourself be guided. 6 months had passed since that first Thanksgiving dinner at the Ellington table. 6 months of every Sunday being the same and yet never the same. Isabella would call on Saturday to confirm, "You're coming tomorrow, right?" And I'd say yes, even though we both knew I would never miss it. The first Sunday after Thanksgiving had been the hardest. I'd driven to their house with my hands shaking, convinced that maybe the invitation had been a pity gesture. Maybe they'd regretted asking a stranger into their family dinner. Maybe this second Sunday would be the last. But Isabella opened the door with a smile that erased every doubt. "You came back," she said, like it was the greatest gift. Come in. We've been waiting." After that, I stopped doubting. Every Sunday became a ritual. I'd leave my apartment at 6:15 p.m. I'd arrive at the Ellington house at 6:50 p.m. Isabella would hug me at the door. William would shake my hand and ask about my week. David and Karen would already be there with Marcus, who'd started calling me Uncle Preston somewhere around the third week. By month 2, I had a drawer in their guest bedroom. Just a small drawer, but it was mine. My clothes lived there. My toothbrush lived in their bathroom. There was a photo of me on their refrigerator between pictures of their grandchildren. I was becoming part of their family. By month 3, I'd stopped thinking of myself as a guest. I'd started making suggestions about dinner. Isabella actually listened to me. I'd started helping William with projects around the house on Saturday afternoons. I'd started babysitting Marcus sometimes when David and Karen needed to go out. I was being integrated into their lives, and they were being integrated into mine. By month 4, something shifted inside me. I stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. I stopped bracing myself for the moment they'd tell me this experiment and chosen family had run its course. I stopped preparing myself for disappointment. Instead, I started believing, truly believing, that this was real. Isabella noticed. "You're different," she said to me one Sunday as we were preparing dinner together in the kitchen. "You're lighter, like you're not carrying something so heavy anymore." "I think I'm starting to believe this is real," I admitted. "That you actually want me here." Isabella set down her knife and took both my hands. "Preston," she said, looking directly into my eyes, "we don't just want you here. We chose you. Every Sunday we choose you, and we'll keep choosing you." I felt tears prick my eyes, but I didn't look away. By month 5, something else happened. Rachel started calling me more frequently, not just check-ins, but real conversations. She told me about work. She asked my advice on things. She told me she was seeing someone seriously, and she wanted me to meet him eventually. "Dad," she said one Thursday evening, "I'm really happy. And a lot of that is because I can see you're happy with the Ellingtons, with your life. I've never seen you like this." I realized listening to her that I'd been so focused on Gerald's rejection that I'd never fully acknowledged Rachel's acceptance. She'd never stopped believing in me. She'd just been waiting for me to believe in myself. By month 6, I'd settled into a rhythm that felt like home. Sunday dinners were sacred. I wouldn't miss one for anything. The Ellington family had become the structure that held my life together. They'd become the reason I got up in the morning. They'd become my purpose. And then on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, my phone rang. Gerald's name flashed on the screen. That call didn't come after weeks of silence. It came after 5 full years of nothing. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, to pretend I hadn't seen it, to continue living in the peace I'd built over the past 6 months. But another part of me, the part that was still a father, still hoping against hope, made me pick up. "Hey, Dad," Gerald said. His voice sounded different, strained, like he'd rehearsed this call 100 times. "Gerald," I said carefully, "it's been a while." "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry about that. I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened between us, and I think I made a mistake, Dad. I think I was wrong to keep you at such a distance. My heart did something complicated. Hope and suspicion warred inside me." "That's good to hear," I said slowly. "I've missed you." "I've missed you too," Gerald said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Actually, I was wondering if you might want to get together soon. Maybe this weekend I'd really like to talk to you about some things." "Of course," I heard myself say. "I'd like that." After we hung up, I sat on my couch for a long time. The Ellington family had taught me what real love looked like, but Gerald was still my son, and maybe he was ready to change. I didn't know yet that he was already planning to ask me for $50,000. I didn't know yet that the next 6 months would involve coffee shops and phone calls, and the final severing of a relationship that had never been real. All I knew was that I had 6 months of peace behind me, and I was about to lose it. But that evening, I called Isabella. Because even before I understood what was coming, I knew who I needed to talk to. And when Isabella asked what was wrong, I told her everything. About Gerald, about the call, about my hope and my fear. Whatever happens, Isabella said, you have us. You have this family. Remember that. And I held on to those words like a lifeline because somehow I sensed I was going to need them. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the middle of organizing the garage, something I'd been meaning to do for weeks, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't answer. Telemarketers had been relentless lately, and I'd gotten into the habit of screening calls. But something made me look at the screen. Gerald. My heart stopped. Gerald hadn't called in 6 months. 6 months of silence so complete it had almost felt normal. I'd built a life in that silence, a good life, a real life. But there was still a part of me that had never stopped waiting for this exact moment. I answered before I could overthink it. Hello. Dad. His voice was different, smaller somehow, younger. Hi, I wasn't sure if you'd answer. Gerald. I set down the box I'd been holding. My hands were shaking. Hi, how are you? He took a breath. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm really sorry about everything. The things I said, the way I treated you. I was wrong. He stopped. Can we talk? Can I see you? I know I don't have the right to ask, but I'm asking anyway. 6 months of silence followed by a sudden apology didn't feel like healing. It felt like timing. I wanted to say yes immediately. I wanted to hear him out, to let him explain, to believe that somehow we could fix this. That somehow we could go back to the way things were supposed to be, not great, but at least like we were trying. But something made me hesitate. Yes, I said carefully. Yeah, we can talk. When we set up a meeting for Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop not far from my apartment. After we hung up, I stood in the garage for a long time, just holding my phone, trying to process what had just happened. Gerald had called. Gerald had apologized. Gerald wanted to see me. It felt like a miracle. But something in my chest felt off. Some instinct I couldn't quite name was whispering that I needed to be careful. That 6 months of silence followed by a sudden apology was a strange combination. I called William. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear Isabella in the background asking who it was. Preston. William's voice was warm, welcoming the way it always was. What's up? You okay? Gerald called, I said without preamble. There was a pause. What did he say? I told him everything, the apology, the request to meet the coffee shop on Thursday. As I talked, I could almost hear William's concern crystallizing through the phone. That's good, right? I finished, but I was asking, not stating. That he wants to talk? Maybe, William said carefully. But Preston, I want you to think about something. 6 months. He goes 6 months without contacting you. Not a text, not an email, nothing. And then suddenly, he calls out of the blue with an apology. He probably felt bad. I said, though, even as I said it, I could hear how thin the excuse sounded. Maybe, William repeated. Or maybe something changed on his end. Something that made him need you suddenly. Be careful, okay? I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying go with your eyes open. Isabella's voice came through in the background, and William said something I couldn't hear, then came back to me. Isabella says to trust your gut, he said. But she also says to remember that you have people who care about you now. Whatever happens with Gerald, that doesn't change. After we hung up, I sat with William's warning. It lodged itself in my chest like a splinter, not painful but irritating, impossible to ignore. The thing was, I wanted to believe Gerald. I wanted to believe that my son had finally realized his mistake, that he'd finally stood up to Rebecca, that somehow we could rebuild what we'd lost. But William was right. Something about the timing felt off. Thursday came slowly. I spent Wednesday evening choosing what to wear, settling finally on jeans and a button-up shirt that Isabella had said looked good on me. I debated whether to bring anything. Flowers seemed wrong, a gift seemed presumptuous. In the end, I brought nothing but myself, and the complicated tangle of emotions in my chest. Thursday afternoon, I drove to the coffee shop, with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The place was moderately busy, enough people around that it felt safe, but not so many that we wouldn't be able to talk. I ordered a coffee I didn't particularly want, and found a table by the window where I could see Gerald when he arrived. My phone buzzed. A text from Isabella. We're thinking of you. Remember, you're not alone. Another from David. Whatever happens, you got this. Rachel had sent a voice memo. Hey, Dad, I know Gerald called. Just be careful, okay? I love you. I sat there with my coffee and my phone full of people who loved me, people I'd gained by losing Gerald, and I waited for my son to walk through the door. And I tried to reconcile two contradictory truths. The first was that I still wanted my son back, that despite everything, despite the 6 months of silence, despite William's warnings, part of me still hoped that somehow we could fix this, that Gerald could be the son I'd always wanted him to be. The second was that I was no longer dependent on that happening, that I had a family now, a real one, a chosen one, and that no matter what Gerald said or did, I was going to be okay. Those two truths sat in my chest, like stones in different pockets, weighing me down in different directions. I finished half my coffee and stared out the window, watching cars pass by, watching people walk past the coffee shop window, watching the world continue on like everything was normal, when everything felt like it was about to change. At exactly 2 p.m., I saw Gerald's car pull into the parking lot. The coffee shop was in downtown Austin, a small place Gerald had chosen. I arrived 10 minutes early and ordered a black coffee I didn't want, just to have something to do with my hands. Gerald walked in at exactly the time we'd agreed. I recognized him immediately, but it took me a moment to process what I was seeing. He looked older than he should have, thinner, dark circles under his eyes. His hands moved constantly, fidgeting with his wallet, adjusting his shirt collar, running through his hair. He hesitated before walking over, then sat down across from me. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Gerald, it's good to see you." I meant it. "Yeah, you too," he said. But his eyes looked past me at the door at other customers, anywhere but at me. We ordered food we wouldn't finish. Gerald got coffee and a sandwich. I got soup. We made small talk. How was Austin? How was work? The kind of conversation strangers have when they're not sure how to talk to each other. Then Gerald started telling me about the business. He explained it carefully like he'd practiced. The startup was promising. Good market. He was operations manager. Rebecca had invested family money. Everything was going well until it wasn't. "We made some bad decisions," Gerald said, stirring his coffee. "I made some bad decisions. The market shifted faster than we anticipated. We didn't adapt quickly enough. And then Rebecca's father, he got involved. He started asking questions, demanding answers, and Rebecca, she blamed me. He looked up at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected: fear. "I lost my job, Dad," he said quietly. 2 months ago, and I haven't told Rebecca's family yet. Rebecca knows, but her father doesn't. I don't know how to fix it." I listened. I didn't interrupt. I just listened to my son tell me about his failures, and I could see how much it cost him, to be honest. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said. "That sounds really difficult." "It is," Gerald said. "And Rebecca's not handling it well. She's angry at me. Her father's angry at me. And I'm just trying to figure out how to get out of this hole." He was looking at me with something that might have been hope or desperation, or both. I wanted to help him, but I also recognized something in the way he was telling this story. There was a structure to it, a narrative arc designed to make me feel sympathy, to make me feel like I owed him something. "Gerald," I said carefully, "have you talked to a therapist or a financial advisor? Someone who could help you work through this?" "I've thought about it," Gerald said, "but I don't have the money for that right now. That's part of the problem." We talked for another 30 minutes. Gerald told me more about Rebecca's family drama, about the pressure he was under, about how scared he was. And with every story I felt him building towards something, preparing me for something. He didn't ask outright that day. He was testing the ground. I drove home that evening unsettled. Gerald hadn't explicitly asked for money at the coffee shop, but sitting across from him, watching his hands shake as he stirred his coffee, listening to the carefully crafted story about Rebecca and her father, and the collapsed investment, I understood. He'd been testing me, preparing me, making sure I felt sorry for him before he made the real ask. I knew there would be another call, a harder one. And this time there would be no gentle framing, no carefully constructed narrative, just the demand naked and direct. That night I called Isabella. "You sound upset," she said when she answered. "I saw Gerald today," I said, "for coffee, and I realized something. He's going to ask me for money." "How do you know?" Isabella asked gently. "Because I know him," I said. "I know the way he manipulates. I know how he builds a case. And I know that meeting today was stage 1. He was preparing me, testing to see if I'd be sympathetic before he made the real ask." "And will you be?" Isabella asked. "No," I said, "because helping him with money isn't going to fix what's wrong. And somewhere along the way, I have to stop trying to save him and start saving myself." Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's very wise." It doesn't feel wise, I said. It feels like I'm abandoning him. You're not abandoning him, Isabella said. You're setting a boundary. There's a difference. After we hung up, I sat with that distinction. Abandonment versus boundary. For 30 years, I'd thought they were the same thing. For 30 years, I'd believed that saying no to Gerald meant I didn't love him. But sitting in my apartment that night, I understood that Isabella was right. There was a difference. And the difference was this. I could love my son and still refuse to be used by him. I could care about Gerald's well-being and still protect my own. Letting go doesn't mean closing the door forever. It means no longer begging for someone to walk through it. The door was still open. I'd given Gerald a chance. I'd met him for coffee. I'd listened to his story. But I'd stopped standing in the doorway waiting for him to transform into the father I'd always wanted him to be. I'd stopped hoping he might finally see me, want me, prove that all those years hadn't been for nothing. The question was whether I'd have the strength to hold that boundary when he called again. Before I reveal what happened next, let me ask you something. If you were in my position after hearing everything Gerald said, would you keep the door open? Or would you protect the life you've finally built? Share your thoughts in the comments so I know you're still here with me. And just a gentle note, the next part of this story includes some fictionalized elements added for narrative and reflection. If this isn't for you, it's completely okay to stop watching here. The second call came 3 weeks later, a Thursday evening in early June. I was watering the tomato plants Isabella had helped me plant on the back porch when the phone rang. Gerald again. This time I knew what was coming. "We're out of time," he said without preamble. No greeting, no pretense of small talk. The mask had slipped. "The investors are pulling out. If we don't have 50,000 by the end of the month, the whole thing collapses." I set down the watering can. "I can't help you with that, Gerald." "You're not listening. I need 50,000, not advice, not resources. $50,000 transferred to my account by June 30th. The directness was almost a relief. At least now we were standing in the truth. "No," I said. "You sold the house. I know you have it. You have far more than what I'm asking for, and you're going to let me go under because you want to play therapist and pretend you've suddenly figured out parenting." I felt the words like small stones. They landed, but they didn't break anything. That was the strange new clarity I'd found. Gerald's anger couldn't touch the thing I'd built with Isabella and William with Rachel, with this new life. "That's not why I'm saying no," I said quietly. Then why would you have money sitting around while your son—" "Because," I interrupted, "giving you $50,000 won't save your marriage. It won't fix the investment. It won't make Rebecca love you more or her father respect you. It will just delay the moment you have to actually deal with what's happening. I don't need your psychology. I need money." "I know, but I can't be the solution to that problem anymore." There was a pause. I could hear Rebecca in the background asking what I'd said. Gerald must have covered the phone. When he came back, his voice was different, sharper, more dangerous. "Mom used to say the same thing," he said, "that I needed to handle my own problems, that she couldn't rescue me. You know what that did? It made me feel like she didn't give a shit." The comparison landed intentionally. He was giving me the chance to feel guilty, to flinch, to reconsider. It was the move that had always worked before. "Your mother was a good woman," I said, "and she was right. She couldn't save you, and neither can I. But here's what she never got to tell you. That's not the same as not caring. I care about you. I care that you're scared. I care that your marriage is struggling and your business is failing. But I cannot fix these things with money, and pretending I can would be a lie we'd both keep believing." "So you're choosing Isabella Ellington over your own son. Is that what you're saying?" The accusation hung there. It was designed to hurt, and it did, but not in the way he'd meant. It hurt because there was a kernel of truth wrapped inside the lie. I was choosing differently. I was prioritizing my own stability. But that wasn't choosing Isabella over Gerald. That was finally, after 56 years, choosing myself. "I'm not choosing Isabella over you," I said. "I'm choosing to stop sacrificing myself to prove something to you that I can never prove. I left you once. I know that. I've carried the guilt of it for decades. But Gerald, using that guilt to make me responsible for your adult decisions, that's not family. That's just prolonging the hurt." "You want to know what hurts?" His voice was sharp, thin as a blade. "Knowing my father would rather buy vegetables and read philosophy with some woman he's known for 6 months than help his own son." I thought of the Sunday dinners. I thought of Marcus's laugh. I thought of Isabella's steady presence and William's quiet wisdom. I thought of Rachel, who had stood by me, even when Gerald was demanding money, who had chosen to love me the way a daughter actually chooses her father, rather than the way a child demands he fix everything. Then I guess we're at an impasse, I said. Because that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm building a life with people who love me as I'm not as a walking checkbook, and I'm not going to apologize for that anymore. Don't bother, he said, because you're dead to me. You got that dead. You don't exist in my life. He didn't wait for me to respond. The line went silent. I stood on the porch for a long time after that. The tomato plants were still waiting to be watered. The sun was setting behind the fence, painting the small garden in shades of amber and rose. Everything looked exactly the same as it had before the call, but I felt different, lighter somehow. Like I'd been carrying something so long, I'd forgotten I had the choice to set it down. I picked up the watering can. The earth was dry. It needed nourishing. Later, when Isabella and William came over for dinner, I didn't tell them what Gerald had said. But as I set the table, as I heard William laugh in the kitchen, as I felt Isabella's steady hand squeeze my shoulder, I knew I'd already made my choice. I'd made it months ago at a restaurant in Austin, when a kind woman decided to invite a lonely stranger to her table. Gerald would be angry about that for a long time, perhaps forever. But for the first time, I was okay with that. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and made a decision that would change everything. Isabella and William had listened to my story. Isabella had held my hand while I talked. William had nodded at all the right moments. They had offered me a guest room, but I had declined. I needed to be alone with this. I needed to sit with the weight of what I'd just learned and figure out who I was going to be in response to it. So, I came home to my quiet apartment, and I sat in the dark, letting the full reality of Gerald's betrayal wash over me. He hadn't just rejected me 6 months ago. He'd rejected me, let me suffer, let me believe I was the problem, let me spend months questioning what I'd done wrong, and then he'd come back, not because he missed me, not because he loved me, not because he finally understood what he had lost. He'd come back because he needed money. The bitterness of it sat in my throat like poison. I thought about Gerald as a child. I thought about all the soccer games I'd attended, all the times I'd stayed up late helping him with homework, all the times I'd put his needs before my own, believing that was what being a father meant. That if I just loved him enough, if I just tried hard enough, he'd eventually understand that everything I did was for him. I thought about his teenage years when Rebecca had started becoming a presence in his life. I thought about how gradually he'd pulled away, how he'd stopped calling, how family dinners became obligatory instead of anticipated, how I'd watch my son choose someone else over me again and again and again. And I'd accepted it. I'd told myself that was what good fathers do. They let their children grow up. They let them make their own choices. They don't demand love or loyalty. But that wasn't what was happening here. What was happening here was that my son was going to use me. He was going to show up with an apology he didn't mean, with words he'd probably rehearsed with a performance designed to make me feel loved, so that when he asked for money, I'd be too emotionally invested to say no. I thought about the coffee shop, about the desperation in his eyes, about the way his hands had shaken when I asked questions he didn't want to answer, about the way he'd interrupted me when I got too close to the truth. He'd been planning this the entire time, probably planning it since he lost his job 4 months ago, probably waiting for the right moment to make contact, probably calculating exactly how much time had to pass so that the pain would dull enough for me to be receptive to his apology. And I'd almost fallen for it. If Rachel hadn't called, if she hadn't had the courage to tell me the truth, I probably would have sat through that dinner this weekend and heard whatever pitch Gerald had prepared. And I probably would have said yes. I probably would have opened my wallet and told myself I was helping my son, when really I'd just be enabling his bad decisions and rewarding his manipulation. I sat in the dark and I felt the full weight of every rejection. Every time Gerald had chosen Rebecca over me, every time he'd made it clear I wasn't welcome, every holiday I'd spent wondering what I'd done wrong, every phone call that never came, every moment I'd spent trying to be good enough for my own son. And I made a decision. No more. I would not give Gerald 1 dime, not 1 penny, not $1, not if he begged, not if he cried, not if he told me Rebecca was leaving him, or they were going to lose their house, or everything was falling apart. Because here was the thing I'd finally understood in 6 months of Sunday dinners and unconditional acceptance. Love wasn't conditional. Real love didn't come with a price tag. Real love didn't show up only when it needed something. Isabella and William loved me for who I was. They didn't love me for what I could give them. They didn't manipulate me into their lives with rehearsed apologies and false promises. They simply chose to show up for me week after week without asking for anything in return. That was love. What Gerald was doing wasn't love. It was predatory. It was calculated. It was the behavior of someone who'd seen his father's goodness and decided to exploit it. I pulled out my phone and looked at the time. It was too late to call anyone, but I typed out a text to Rachel. Thank you for telling me the truth. Whatever happens this weekend, I want you to know that I'm not going to help him financially. She responded almost immediately. Good, I love you, Dad. 3 words, no conditions, just simple, honest love. I thought about how Gerald had never said that to me in 6 months. Not once. No, I love you texts. No genuine expressions of affection. Just strategic silence followed by a calculated apology. The anger I felt in that moment was clarifying. It wasn't the anger of someone broken. It was the anger of someone who'd finally seen clearly. The anger of someone who'd stopped making excuses for the people who hurt him. The anger of someone who'd decided that enough was enough. I sat in my apartment through the night not sleeping, but not restless either, just still. Just present with the decision I'd made. By the time the sun came up, I was calm. I knew what was going to happen. Gerald was going to ask me for money, probably this weekend, probably with some variation of the emotional manipulation I'd already witnessed. And I was going to say no. Not angrily, not bitterly, though. I had every right to be bitter. Just clearly, firmly, with the kind of boundary setting that came from finally understanding my own worth. I didn't need Gerald's love to be worthy of love. I didn't need his approval to know I was a good person. I didn't need to sacrifice my own well-being to prove to him that I cared. I had already learned those things from a family that had chosen me, from William and Isabella and David and Karen and Rachel, and even little Marcus, who called me uncle. I had already learned what it meant to be valued simply for existing, to be wanted just because I was me. And Gerald's manipulation couldn't erase that. His desperation couldn't undo it. His calculated apology couldn't diminish it. Because the thing about finding real love is that it gives you the strength to walk away from fake love. It teaches you what boundaries look like. It shows you that you're worth more than someone's financial needs. That morning, I got out of bed and I looked at myself in the mirror. And I made a promise to the man looking back at me. Gerald Dalton would not get another penny from me. Not today, not ever. He'd had his chance to be my son. He'd chosen someone else instead. And now I had a real family, and I was going to protect that family and myself by refusing to be exploited any longer. No more. Not one dime, not one single dollar. That was my decision, and I was going to stick to it. I didn't tell Isabella and William about Gerald's call that first evening. I didn't know how to put it into words. How do you tell people who have shown you unconditional kindness that your biological son had just declared you dead? Instead, I went home to my apartment and sat in the dark for 3 hours. I kept replaying his words, not the specific ones. I wanted to forget those, but the tone underneath them, the desperation mixed with anger, the blame, the certainty that I owed him something I couldn't give. What struck me most wasn't his rage. It was how familiar it felt. This wasn't the first time Gerald had called with a crisis. This wasn't the first time he'd used guilt as a weapon. This wasn't the first time he'd acted like my refusal to save him meant he didn't love him. This was a pattern that had been playing out for 30 years, and I'd been so busy trying to prove I could be the father he wanted that I'd never stopped to ask, was I responsible for saving him? I thought about all the moments leading up to this call, Gerald's resentment when I left Connecticut, his coldness when I called on holidays, his distance when I tried to visit. And underneath all of that, the unspoken message, you abandoned me and now you owe me. But that wasn't true. I hadn't abandoned Gerald. I'd left a marriage. There's a difference. I'd tried to maintain a relationship with him, even when he made it clear he didn't want one. I'd reached out. I'd apologized for things I wasn't sure I'd done wrong, just to keep the door open. I'd spent years waiting for him to decide I was worth having in his life. And then I met Isabella. Sitting in that apartment, I realized something Isabella had taught me what real family looked like. It wasn't obligatory. It wasn't based on debt. It wasn't about blood or history or who owed what to whom. It was about choosing, every day, without keeping score. Gerald didn't know how to do that. Maybe Rebecca had taught him that love was transactional. Maybe his father-in-law's pressure had broken something in him. Maybe his own shame about losing his job had made him desperate enough to use his son as leverage. I didn't know. But I did know that whatever was happening in his life, it wasn't my responsibility to fix it. The next evening I called Rachel. "Hey, Dad," she answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" I told her about Gerald's call. I told her about the $50,000. I told her about how Gerald had ended it. "You're dead to me." She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long pause. "Dad," she finally said, "I'm proud of you." "Is for what telling him no? For protecting yourself," Rachel said. "For setting a boundary, for recognizing that you can't save him. That's not your job. That was never your job." "But I'm his father," I said, and I could hear the doubt in my own voice. "You are," Rachel said. "But being his father doesn't mean you have to sacrifice yourself. It doesn't mean you have to give him money you've earned or make decisions based on his manipulation or accept blame for his choices. Being a good father means knowing when to say no." After we hung up, I sat with her words. She was right. I'd spent 30 years trying to be the father Gerald needed me to be, which meant being whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. And when I couldn't be that, when I finally said no, he declared me dead. But I wasn't dead. I was more alive than I'd ever been. I was alive in Isabella's Sunday dinners. I was alive in William's steady presence. I was alive in Rachel's support and understanding. I was alive in the small, quiet moments at the bookstore when I helped a customer find exactly what they needed. And that life, the real one, the one I'd chosen, was worth protecting. Gerald had given me an ultimatum, and I'd chosen without hesitation. I'd chosen the Ellington family. I'd chosen people who showed up for me without requiring me to prove my worth. I'd chosen people who loved me because they decided to not because they had to. The grief didn't come immediately. For days I was numb. Gerald was gone from my life in a way that felt almost clean. There was no ambiguity, no wondering if I should call, no guilt about not reaching out. He'd made the decision for me. By the time Sunday came around, I was ready to be around Isabella and William. I wasn't ready to tell them everything that would come later, but I was ready to sit at their table and let their kindness remind me that I'd made the right choice. As I drove to their house, I thought about Gerald one last time. I hoped he'd figure things out. I hoped Rebecca would get help. I hoped his marriage would survive. But I also knew that none of that was my responsibility anymore. I'd finally truly let go. And in that letting go, I'd found something I didn't know I was looking for: the freedom to be someone's son without being responsible for their salvation. The silence after I hung up was different from before. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't hope. This was finality. I stood in the break room of the bookstore, phone still in my hand, and I understood something with absolute certainty: I would never hear from Gerald again. Not a phone call, not an email, not a text message. Gerald had made his choice, and I was making mine. I called William immediately. He answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting. "Preston." "What's wrong?" "Gerald tried to use me for money," I said. My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. I said no. He got angry. He told me I was dead to him and hung up. There was a pause on William's end. Then, "Come over, now. We need to be together." I drove to the Ellington house as the sun was setting. The sky was turning shades of orange and purple. Isabella was on the porch waiting for me. She didn't ask questions. She just pulled me into her arms. "He tried to use you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said into her shoulder. "And when I said no, he attacked me." "Then he did you a favor," William said, appearing beside us. "He showed you exactly who he is. No ambiguity, no more wondering, no more hoping." We went inside. The dinner table was still set. Food was still warm. Isabella sat me down and put a plate in front of me without asking if I was hungry. David and Karen looked at me with knowing eyes they had clearly been told. Marcus was asleep upstairs, thank goodness. Eat, Isabella said simply. I didn't have the energy to refuse. As I ate, I told them everything. Gerald's initial call, his fake apology at the coffee shop, Rachel's revelation about his job loss and debt, and this final call where Gerald had screamed at me and called me selfish and cruel. He's right about one thing, I said, setting down my fork. I did leave. I did divorce his mother. I did move away and try to start over. Maybe that makes me a bad father in his eyes. Preston, Isabella said gently. But I'm done apologizing for it, I continued. I'm done trying to earn his love. I'm done waiting for him to understand that I'm a human being with needs too. I'm done. I looked around the table at Isabella, William, David, Karen. I've spent 35 years trying to be the father Gerald wanted. I've spent 35 years trying to be good enough, worthy enough, present enough. And he still doesn't love me. He still doesn't want me. So now I'm going to make a different choice. Isabella reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I choose this family, I said. I choose you, all of you. I choose to spend my life with the people who truly choose me. What are you saying? William asked. I'm saying I'm done waiting for Gerald. I'm done hoping he'll call. I'm done believing he might change. He's made his choice and I'm making mine. From this moment forward, I'm fully committed to this family, to you, to this life we're building together. William nodded slowly. That's the strongest thing I've heard you say, Preston. Since that call, Gerald completely disappeared for the next 5 years, right up until Rachel's wedding. For 5 years, he would not call. He would not write. He would not reach out in any way. For 5 years, I would wake up on Sunday mornings with anticipation instead of dread. I would drive to the Ellington house knowing I was wanted. I would sit at their table knowing I belonged there. For 5 years, Gerald would choose silence. And in that silence, I would learn to live. Later that night, after David and Karen had left, after Isabella had made tea, Isabella and William and I sat on the porch. The stars were coming out over Austin. The night was cool and clear. He won't call again, I said. It wasn't a question. No. William agreed. He won't. He got what he wanted and he told you exactly what he thinks of you. He probably feels like he won. Did he? I asked. No, Isabella said firmly. He lost. He lost you. He lost the possibility of ever having a real relationship with you. He lost everything that actually matters. I thought about Gerald, about the 5 years of silence that were about to begin. I thought about how he'd spend those years wondering if maybe he should try again. I thought about how he'd probably never understand that he'd already had his chances, multiple chances, and he'd squandered all of them. I'm grateful, I said finally, for all of this, for you, for this family, for teaching me what love actually is. We're grateful for you, Isabella said, for choosing us, for showing up, for being willing to be part of something real. That night I slept in the guest room at the Ellington house, and as I lay there in the dark, I made a final decision. I would not contact Gerald again. Not ever. If he called, I wouldn't answer. If he showed up at my door, I wouldn't let him in. I would spend the next 5 years, and however long after that, building a life with the family that had chosen me. I had finally learned the difference between family by blood and family by choice, and I was choosing the latter. The church was filled with light. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, painting the wooden pews in gold and blue and rose. Rachel stood at the end of the aisle in a dress that made her look like the woman she'd become, strong, sure, beautiful in the way that people are when they've finally arrived at where they're supposed to be. The veil draped around her shoulders caught the light and shimmered like water, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. This was my daughter. This was the girl I'd watched grow up, the woman who'd never stopped believing in me, even when I'd stopped believing in myself. I stood in the front row between Isabella and William, and I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders like a benediction. Isabella's hand found mine and squeezed gently. William leaned close and whispered, "You did good raising her." I wanted to tell him that Rachel had raised herself in many ways, that she'd become who she was despite my failures, not because of my guidance. But the music was starting, and the words caught in my throat. Behind us, Marcus sat in his best suit, already squirming. He was 9 now, tall and gangly, losing teeth and gaining opinions about everything. Sophia was with Karen, too young to sit through the ceremony without a meltdown. She'd already tried to escape twice during the processional giggling, as Karen scooped her up and redirected her attention to the flowers. The Ellington family filled 3 pews. My family. The one I'd chosen and who'd chosen me back. David sat with his arm around Karen, both of them watching their children with the patient exhaustion of parents who had learned to embrace chaos. Isabella's sister had flown in from California. William's brother and his wife occupied the pew behind us. This was a tribe. This was what belonging looked like. Rachel walked down the aisle, and I watched James's face change when he saw her. His eyes went wide, then soft, then filled with something that looked like awe. He pressed his hand to his chest like he needed to remind his heart to keep beating. That's what real love looks like, I thought. That recognition. That choosing every single day to see the person in front of you. Not the person you wish they were, not the person you're trying to change them into, but the person they actually are, flaws and beauty and everything in between. The ceremony passed in a blur of words and promises. The priest spoke about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Rachel and James exchanged vows they had written themselves, voices steady even as tears streamed down their faces. When James promised to choose Rachel every day to show up, even when it was hard to build a life together based on honesty and grace, I felt Isabella squeeze my hand tighter. She knew what those words meant to me. She knew that I was hearing an echo of the promises I'd made and broken decades ago, and also the promises I'd learned to keep in the years since. I cried, and I wasn't ashamed of it. The tears came quietly at first, then harder, until my shoulders shook. Isabella squeezed my hand. William put his arm around my shoulders. Marcus glanced back at me with concern, and I nodded to let him know I was okay. These weren't tears of sadness. These were tears of gratitude. Gratitude that Rachel had found someone who would love her the way she deserved. Gratitude that I was here to witness it. Gratitude that, 5 years ago, I'd made a choice to walk away from manipulation and toward genuine connection, and that choice had led me to this moment. When the priest pronounced Rachel and James married, the church erupted in applause, and I found myself cheering louder than anyone else. I stood up without thinking, clapping until my hands hurt, watching my daughter kiss her husband for the first time as a married couple. Isabella was crying beside me. William was grinning. Marcus whooped, and Sophia clapped her tiny hands together, delighted by the noise, even if she didn't understand what was happening. At the reception, everything was perfect in the way that weddings are, when the people throwing them have thought of every detail. Flowers and string lights hung from the ceiling of the outdoor pavilion, creating a canopy of soft light as the sun began to set. Tables were arranged in a semicircle around a central dance floor. A band played jazz standards from the 40s and 50s, the kind of music Isabella loved. The air smelled like flowers and good food and possibility. Before the reception started in earnest, before the first dance, Rachel pulled me aside into a quiet corner of the venue. Her face was flushed from the ceremony, her hair slightly askew where the veil had been removed. She looked radiant and nervous and young all at once. "Dad, I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "What, sweetheart?" I invited Gerald. Rachel had kept some contact with him over the years, texts, brief updates. He knew pieces of my life, just not the whole truth. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I know you haven't talked to him in 5 years. I know what he did. I know how much he hurt you. But he's still my brother, and I thought he should have the chance to be here, to see this." The words took a moment to land. "Gerald!" "I've been in touch with him for a while." Rachel said the words coming faster now. "Just texts, checking in. I know you don't want to talk about him, and I respect that. But he's still my brother, and I didn't know if—" She paused, gathering courage. "I didn't know if he'd actually come, but I needed to invite him. I needed him to see what real family looks like. What you built here." I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not even disappointment. Just a kind of complicated love for this daughter who'd had the courage to make her own choice, separate from mine. Rachel had every right to maintain a relationship with Gerald. He was her brother. They'd grown up together. Whatever had broken between Gerald and me didn't have to break between Gerald and Rachel. Does he know? I asked carefully. About Isabella and William. No, Rachel said firmly. He thinks it's just our family, a regular wedding. He has no idea who's going to be there. He doesn't know about the Ellingtons. He doesn't know that you've built this whole life without him. I thought... She hesitated. I thought maybe it was time he saw, time he understood what he gave up. I nodded, slowly processing this. Rachel was giving Gerald a mirror, letting him see what he'd lost without warning him first. I wasn't sure if that was kind or cruel, but it was Rachel's choice to make. This was her wedding. These were her family dynamics to navigate. And if she wanted to give Gerald one more chance to witness what love actually looked like, who was I to stop her? Okay, I said. Thank you for telling me. Rachel hugged me, and I held her for a moment longer than usual. I breathed in the scent of her perfume and the flowers in her hair. I felt the weight of her against me, this grown woman who'd once been a little girl climbing into my lap. I love you, Dad, she whispered. Thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up for me always. Always, I promised, and I meant it. The reception proceeded as receptions do. Dinner was served, salmon and chicken and roasted vegetables, everything perfectly seasoned and beautifully plated. Toasts were given. James's best man told stories about their college years that made everyone laugh. Rachel's maid of honor cried through her entire speech, and Rachel cried with her. The band played songs from the 60s and 70s, and people filled the dance floor with a joy that felt contagious. Marcus danced with Isabella, his serious face pure concentration itself, as he tried to match her steps. He kept counting under his breath, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and Isabella smiled down at him with such tenderness that I felt my chest tighten. Sophia toddled across the dance floor and back victorious in her small journey, shrieking with delight every time someone clapped for her. William and I stood at the edge of the reception area, watching the crowd. The sun had set fully now, and the string lights cast everything in a warm, golden glow. People were laughing and dancing and celebrating, and I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. Rachel made a brave choice, William said quietly. Inviting Gerald. She did. Are you angry? I considered this. Was I angry that Gerald might show up and disrupt this perfect evening? Was I angry that Rachel had maintained a relationship with him, despite everything? Was I angry that I might have to face my son for the first time in 5 years? No, I said finally. Surprised, a little sad maybe, but not angry. That's growth, William said. He put his hand on my shoulder the way he'd done countless times over the past 5 years. That gesture of solidarity, that wordless communication that said, I'm here. You're not alone. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I didn't realize Gerald had entered the pavilion until after the family dance ended. He was standing near the bar, nursing a drink, watching us, with an expression I couldn't quite read from across the room. The reception was in full swing, laughter and music, and the clink of glasses creating a symphony of celebration. But suddenly all I could focus on was the lone figure standing apart from it all. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the crowded reception. 5 years, 60 months, 1,800 days of silence so complete it had almost felt like peace. And suddenly there he was, older, harder, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit and shoes scuffed from travel. His hair had thinned at the temples. There were lines around his mouth that hadn't been there before. He looked like a man who'd carried heavy burdens and hadn't quite figured out how to set them down. But what struck me most was the look on his face when he saw Isabella, William, and me standing together on the dance floor. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't even surprise. It was something deeper and more complicated. Recognition, not of familiarity, but of loss. He was watching his father, his biological father, standing between two people who held him like he belonged there. Two people who laughed with him and danced with him and treated him like family. And he understood in that instant that he'd given this away, that he'd chosen anger and rejection over this warmth, this belonging, this unconditional acceptance. Isabella's hand was still in mine from the dance. William's arm was still around my shoulders. We stood there together, the three of us, and I watched Gerald's face as he processed what he was seeing. His jaw tightened. His grip on the glass in his hand became white-knuckled. But underneath the tension, I saw something else. Something that looked like regret. The song ended. The dance floor began to clear as people returned to their tables. Marcus ran past me chasing Sophia, both of them shrieking with laughter. David called after them to slow down before someone got hurt. The normal chaos of family life continued around us, and Gerald stood there watching it all, like a man observing something through a window he couldn't open. I excused myself from Isabella and William and walked toward him. My legs felt heavy each step deliberate. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't know if I should say anything at all. But something pulled me forward. Not obligation, not guilt, but a kind of closure I didn't know I needed until this moment. Gerald. Preston. He used my name like it tasted bitter, like it was a foreign word in his mouth. Or should I call you Dad? I hear that's what the kids call you now. The words were designed to hurt, to remind me that other children had claimed a title he'd rejected, but they didn't land the way he intended. I'd stopped measuring my worth by Gerald's approval years ago. How much do you know? I asked quietly. Enough, Gerald said, gesturing toward Isabella and William with his drink. His hand trembled slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was from anger or something else. Rachel told me some things when I texted her, asked me to come today. Didn't tell me the whole truth, though. Didn't mention that you'd already replaced us, that you'd already found a new family. The accusation hung in the air between us. Around us, the reception continued, people laughing, the band playing waiters moving between tables with trays of champagne. But in this small corner near the bar, time seemed to slow down. That's not what this is, I said, keeping my voice steady. No! Gerald's voice had an edge sharp enough to cut. Then what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you got everything you wanted. A family that actually wants you. Parents who actually care. A daughter who treats you like you walk on water. Everything we couldn't give you. Before I could respond, Isabella appeared beside me. She must have seen us talking and sensed the tension. William was a few steps behind her, his presence solid and reassuring. They flanked me the way they'd done countless times over the past 5 years, not to fight my battles, but to remind me I wasn't alone. Gerald. Isabella said softly, and there was such gentleness in her voice that even Gerald seemed to pause. We never wanted to replace anyone. Preston came into our lives, and we chose to love him. That choice didn't diminish anything. It added something. That's a nice story, Gerald said bitterly, and I could hear the years of resentment compressed into those few words. But that's not how family works. Family is exclusive. You don't get to have both. You don't get to abandon your real family and then just build a replacement like nothing happened. The word abandon hit me like a physical blow. It was the same accusation he'd thrown at me 5 years ago during that phone call. The same weapon he'd wielded to try to make me feel guilty enough to give him money. The same narrative he had built about me, the father who walked away, who chose himself over his family, who deserved to be punished for his selfishness. Actually, I said, and my voice came out stronger than I expected, you do have to choose, and I did. 5 years ago after our last conversation, I chose this family because they chose me, because they saw me, because they didn't make loving them conditional on me being someone I'm not. Gerald's jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. You chose them over your own son. No, I said firmly, and this time Isabella squeezed my hand in support. I chose peace over pain. I chose people who would meet me halfway over, people who required me to grovel and apologize for existing. I chose to stop waiting for you to decide I was worth loving. The words seemed to strike something in Gerald. His expression shifted anger, giving way to something more vulnerable, more raw. You abandoned me, he said, and for the first time I heard something other than anger in his voice. I heard grief, real unprocessed grief. A young man who'd made terrible choices and was now facing the consequences of those choices. A son who'd pushed his father away and was only now realizing what he'd lost. I set a boundary. I said, and I was surprised by how calm I felt. 5 years ago, this conversation would have destroyed me. it would have sent me spiraling into guilt and self-doubt. But standing here now, flanked by Isabella and William, I felt grounded in a way I'd never felt before. After you asked me for money, you had no intention of repaying. After you called me with lies instead of truth. After you told me I was dead to you. I stepped back and I let Rachel maintain her relationship with you because that was her choice to make. But me, I'm done, Gerald. I'm done trying to be enough for you. I'm done measuring my worth by your approval. Isabella squeezed my hand again, and I could feel William's steady presence behind me. They weren't intervening. They weren't trying to fix this. They were simply there bearing witness to this moment, reminding me that I had support no matter what happened next. You've been gone for 5 years. I continued the words coming easier now. Not dead, just absent. And I built a life in that absence. A real life. A family that shows up. That chooses me every single day the way I choose them. Gerald looked at the three of us standing together. His eyes moved from me to Isabella to William, and I could see him processing what he was seeing. This wasn't a random connection. This wasn't casual friendship. This was family. Real, chosen, intentional family. The kind of family that showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. His gaze drifted across the room to where Rachel was dancing with James, her face radiant with joy. Then to Marcus and Sophia, who were now sitting at a table with David and Karen. Marcus showing Sophia something on his phone while she giggled. He was seeing a whole ecosystem of love and belonging that had formed in his absence. A family that had made space for me in a way he never had. I should have treated you better, Gerald said finally, and the words sounded like they cost him something. Like he was pulling them up from somewhere deep and painful. When you needed me. Yes, I said simply. You should have. I can't fix that now. No, I agreed, and there was no satisfaction in the admission, just truth. You can't. But you can make different choices going forward. You can decide to be better, to mean what you say, to choose honesty instead of manipulation. That's all any of us can do. Gerald stood there for a long moment, holding his drink, looking at the man he'd rejected and the family I'd built without him. I could see him struggling with something, pride maybe, or regret, or the painful recognition that he had gambled and lost. In my peripheral vision, I noticed security nearby, 2 men in dark suits standing alert, but not intervening. Rachel must have arranged for them to keep an eye on things. They didn't move, just stood there, present observing, waiting for my signal or for things to escalate too far. I don't know how to do that, Gerald said quietly, and for the first time since this conversation started, he sounded like my son instead of a stranger. He sounded young and lost and uncertain. Then maybe start by going home, I said gently. Start by figuring out what you actually want, who you actually are, when you're not measuring yourself against me or trying to use me. 3 weeks after Rachel's wedding, I sat at the Ellington dining room table on a Sunday evening. The sun was setting outside the windows, casting everything in gold and amber. The way Texas sunsets do when the humidity is just right and the sky turns into layers of color that seem almost impossible. Isabella had made lasagna her famous recipe with 3 kinds of cheese and homemade sauce that simmered for hours. The smell had filled the house from the moment I walked through the door. William had opened wine a bottle he'd been saving for a special occasion, though he never said what made this evening special. Maybe it was just that we were all together. Maybe that was enough. Marcus, now 9 years old, and missing his 2 front teeth, was telling a story about something that happened at school that had everyone laughing. Something about a science experiment gone wrong, and a teacher who had had to evacuate the classroom because of the smell. He was animated, using his hands to demonstrate the explosion, his face scrunched up, as he imitated the teacher's horrified expression. Sophia giggled from her high chair, not understanding the story, but delighted by her brother's performance. David and Karen were trying not to laugh too hard, but failing. Even Rachel and James, who'd stopped by on their way home from somewhere, were grinning. This was life now. These Sunday dinners. These people who'd chosen me the way I'd chosen them. The noise and the laughter and the way conversations overlapped and interrupted each other. The way Isabella would reach over to wipe sauce off Sophia's face. The way William would pour more wine, without asking if anyone wanted it. The way Marcus would steal bites off everyone's plates when he thought no one was looking. This was family, real messy, imperfect, beautiful family. After dessert tiramisu that Isabella had made from scratch, Isabella asked me to say something. It had become a tradition over the years, this moment after the meal, when someone would share a reflection on the week, or the moment, or whatever was weighing on their heart. I'd never been good at these moments. I'd spent most of my life keeping my feelings locked away, believing that vulnerability was weakness. But the Ellingtons had taught me differently. They'd taught me that sharing your truth was how you connected with people, that being seen required being honest. For 35 years, I began my voice steady but quiet enough that everyone had to lean in slightly to hear me. I thought family was something that came to me, something I was bound to by blood or circumstances, something I didn't get to choose but had to accept. I spent 35 years trying to be the kind of father my son would be proud of. 30 years proving myself, believing that if I just worked hard enough, loved wholeheartedly enough, sacrificed deeply enough, everything would be all right. But that never happened. Isabella reached across the table and took my hand. Her touch was warm and familiar, grounding me in this moment. I spent those 30 years looking for belonging in the wrong place. I continued feeling the weight of each word, looking for it in someone who couldn't see me, someone who didn't want to see me. Looking for it in obligation instead of choice, in guilt instead of love, in transactions instead of connection. And then, one Thanksgiving, I sat alone in a restaurant convinced that I was too old and too broken to deserve anything better. And a woman stood up from her table and walked over to mine and asked if I wanted to join her family for dinner. I glanced at Isabella, and she was smiling, her eyes glistening with tears. William had his hand on her shoulder. One moment, I said. One invitation, one yes, and everything changed. Not immediately, change doesn't work like that. But slowly, Sunday by Sunday, meal by meal, conversation by conversation, I started to understand what family actually meant. What it could be when it wasn't built on obligation or expectation, or the desperate need to prove yourself worthy. Rachel leaned forward slightly. I could see her eyes were wet. James had his arm around her shoulders, and I was grateful for his presence, grateful that my daughter had found someone who loved her the way she deserved to be loved. 5 years ago, Gerald called me, I said, and the name still felt strange in my mouth, even after all this time. He didn't call to check on me. He didn't call because he missed me or wanted to repair our relationship. He called to demand money, $50,000. He told me he needed it, that his life depended on it, that if I really loved him, I would help him. When I said no, when I set a boundary for the first time in my life, he told me I was dead to him. He meant it, and for 5 years I didn't hear from him. Not a call, not a text, not a birthday message, nothing. The table had gone quiet. Even Sophia had stopped fidgeting as if she could sense the weight of what I was saying. But here's what I learned in those 5 years. I continued looking at each of their faces. Isabella, with her kind eyes and her unwavering belief in people's capacity to heal. William, with his quiet strength and his steady presence. Marcus, with his gap-toothed smile and his innocent joy. Rachel, with her courage and her grace. David and Karen, with their patience and their generosity. James, with his love for my daughter. Sophia, with her pure, uncomplicated delight in being alive. If family isn't about biology, I said, it's not about obligation. It's not about proving yourself over and over again, hoping someone will finally see your worth. Family is about being chosen. Every single day you're chosen, and you choose back. That's the transaction, not money, not guilt, not debt. Just choice. Mutual, deliberate, daily choice. William squeezed Isabella's hand, and I saw him nod slightly as if affirming what I was saying. Gerald had to learn that the hard way, I said. Or maybe he's still learning it. I don't know. I hope someday he understands that I didn't replace him. I just stopped waiting for him to decide I was worth keeping. I stopped believing that love was something I had to earn through sacrifice and suffering. I stopped measuring my worth by his approval. And I found people who love me without conditions, without keeping score, without needing me to be anything other than honest. I looked directly at Isabella and William now. You took me in when I was a stranger. You invited me to your table when I was sitting alone, convinced that I didn't deserve companionship. You gave me a place at your Sunday dinners, and over these 5 years, you made me part of your family, not as an obligation, not as charity, not because you felt sorry for me, but as a choice. You chose me. Every Sunday you chose me, and that choice changed everything. Marcus grinned, showing off his missing teeth. "Okay, Grandpa, you're getting sappy," he said, but he was smiling, and there was no mockery in his voice, just affection. Just the teasing that happens between people who love each other. I laughed, feeling the tension break. That word still caught me sometimes, Grandpa. I hadn't expected to earn it. I hadn't expected to earn any of this. For so long, I'd believed that my chance at family had passed, that I'd failed at the only thing that really mattered, and that I'd spend the rest of my life paying for that failure. But here I was, surrounded by people who called me family, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. After dinner, while the others cleared the table and loaded the dishwasher, another ritual. Everyone moving around the kitchen in a choreographed dance they had perfected over years. Isabella and I stood on the back porch. The Texas night was warm, the air thick with humidity and the promise of rain. Cicadas were singing in the darkness, their song rising and falling in waves. Isabella put her arm through mine, the way she'd started doing about 3 years ago. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You did good today," she said quietly. Saying all that. "I meant it," I said. "Every word. I know you did. That's why it mattered." She paused, looking out at the darkened yard, where fireflies were beginning to appear, little points of light in the gathering darkness. "You know, I almost didn't invite you that Thanksgiving. I sat at that table watching you eat alone, and I almost convinced myself it wasn't my place. That you probably wanted to be alone, that I'd be intruding. What changed your mind?" I asked, though. I'd wondered this before, and never had the courage to ask. "William," she said simply. "He saw me watching you, and he said, 'That man needs someone to see him, be that person.' So I was." We stood in silence for a moment, and I thought about how many things had to align for that moment to happen. I had to be in that restaurant. Isabella had to notice me. William had to encourage her. I had to say yes. Any one of those things could have gone differently, and my entire life would be different now. "I thank you," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for giving me a chance when I didn't think I deserved one, for teaching me what family actually means." Isabella squeezed my arm. "We didn't see you, Preston. We recognized you. There's a difference. We recognized someone who deserved to be seen, and we chose to do it. And you recognized us right back. You chose us too. That's what makes this work, the mutual choosing." Later that night, after I'd said goodbye to everyone and driven back to my apartment, I lay in bed listening to Austin sounds, distant traffic on the highway, the occasional siren wailing past, the hum of the air conditioning and the settling of the building around me. The city going on, indifferent to individual stories, but containing millions of them. I thought about Gerald. I wondered if he was okay. I wondered if he'd found his way, if he'd figured out what he wanted from life, if he'd learned that love couldn't be demanded or purchased. I wondered if seeing me at Rachel's wedding had changed anything for him, or if he'd just gone back to his life and tried to forget what he'd seen. But I also really knew in a way I hadn't before, that those questions weren't my responsibility anymore. I'd spent 30 years carrying that weight, trying to fix him, trying to be enough for him. I was done. Not done in an angry way, not done in a bitter way, just done, released, free. I woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window, golden and warm. Monday morning, the start of a new week. In a few days, it would be Sunday again, and we'd gather around that table. Isabella would make something delicious, maybe her pot roast, maybe her chicken piccata. William would pour wine and tell stories about his week. Marcus would show me his latest loose tooth, or a drawing he'd made in art class. Rachel and James might stop by, or they might not. David and Karen would bring Sophia, who was getting bigger every week, learning new words and new ways to make everyone laugh. And I would belong, not because I'd proven myself, not because I'd finally been good enough, not because I'd earned it through suffering or sacrifice, but because I'd learned that family isn't something you're born into or something you earn through pain. Family is something you choose. And when you're brave enough to say yes to someone's invitation, when you're willing to sit at a table you weren't born to, when you open yourself to people who open themselves to you, that's when you find it. That's when you come home. You've just heard my story, a man who spent decades searching for love in all the wrong places, especially from a son who wasn't capable of giving it at that time. I allowed myself to become a machine designed solely to feed rejection. I kept going back, kept hoping, kept believing that if I just tried harder, gave more sacrifice deeper, somehow Gerald would finally see me. Somehow he would finally decide I was worth loving. That family betrayal I experienced wasn't just about what Gerald did. It was also about what I did to myself by accepting it for so long. If you're like me, if you're searching for acceptance from people who will never give it, stop now. Don't be like me. Don't waste the precious years waiting for a miracle from someone who doesn't want to change. I wasted 35 years believing that blood made family, that obligation created love, that if I just endured enough rejection, eventually it would transform into acceptance. It never did. And the saddest part wasn't Gerald's rejection. It was how long I accepted it as normal, how long I convinced myself that this was what I deserved. Here's the lesson I learned, and it's simple but profound. Family is not blood. Family is choice. God doesn't send love through DNA alone. He sends it through people who see you suffering and decide to do something about it. Isabella Ellington didn't have to invite me to her table that Thanksgiving. She could have looked at me sitting alone and thought, that's not my problem. But she didn't. She chose compassion. She chose action. She chose me. And that choice changed everything. God sends love through deliberate, daily, unconditional actions. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through showing up. Through Sunday dinners. Through phone calls that ask how you're doing and actually wait for the answer. Through people who see you at your worst and don't walk away. When you find that kind of love, when you find people who choose you without needing you to prove yourself, hold tight. Because that's grace. That's God working through human hands and human hearts. My family story isn't unique. Everywhere there are people experiencing the same family betrayal. I did children rejecting parents, parents rejecting children. Siblings turning against each other over money or pride or old wounds that never healed. We live in a world that tells us family is everything, but nobody teaches us what to do when family becomes the source of our deepest pain. Nobody teaches us that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is walk away. That sometimes setting a boundary isn't abandonment, it's survival. I believe, and this is just my personal understanding, that God doesn't want us to suffer endlessly in the name of family loyalty. I believe God wants us to experience love, real love, the kind that builds us up instead of tearing us down, the kind that sees our worth without needing us to perform for it. I spent years believing that leaving Gerald meant I was failing as a father, but what I learned is that staying in that toxic cycle would have destroyed me. And a destroyed father can't love anyone, not his son, not his daughter, not even himself. The family story I'm sharing with you isn't about revenge or bitterness. It's about liberation. It's about learning that you can love someone from a distance. You can pray for them, hope for them, want good things for them, but you don't have to let them destroy you in the process. Gerald made his choices. I made mine. And both of us have to live with the consequences. The difference is, I'm at peace with mine. If this story touched your heart, if you're also searching for family, or battling rejection, or wondering if you'll ever find people who truly see you, please leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what resonated with you. Share this family story with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's still waiting for love from people who will never give it. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the stories coming next, because there are more people like us than we realize. More people who've experienced family betrayal and found their way to healing. More people who've learned that chosen family can be just as powerful, sometimes more powerful than biological family. God speaks through stories. He speaks through people who've walked through darkness and found their way to light. If my story can be a flashlight for someone else stumbling in the dark, then every year of suffering was worth it. Not because suffering is noble, but because it taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way, that love is a choice and we deserve to be chosen. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end, for listening to this journey from loneliness to belonging, from rejection to acceptance, from searching for family to becoming family. I hope this story felt like a gentle reminder that you deserve to be loved, not the conditional transactional love that demands you prove yourself, but the unconditional, grace-filled love that God intended for all of us. And I need to tell you something important. The stories that follow will contain fictional elements carefully crafted for educational and inspirational purposes. These narratives explore difficult themes and emotional situations, designed to help us understand ourselves and each other better. If you're uncomfortable with dramatic or psychologically heavy content, I encourage you to exit now and choose something else that suits you better. There's no judgment in that choice. We all need different things at different times. But if you're ready, if you want to hear more stories about people finding their way through darkness, about families breaking and reforming, about love lost and found, then stay with me. The next story begins soon. I hope you'll stay for it.